crisis as it reverberates across Central and Eastern Europe. Unease is especially growing in the nearby Baltic states that, until independence in 1991, lived under Russian domination as part of the former Soviet Union. Although Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia all belong to NATO, memories of Soviet oppression are still vivid there. In fact, France has just offered to send warplanes to help provide air patrols over the Baltic states and Poland. And stoking fears in Latvia, an online petition is now doing the rounds, urging a Crimea-style referendum on reunion with Russia. Damien McGuinness reports from Riga.
These Latvians are commemorating the soldiers who died defending Latvia against Russia in the Second World War. But with Russian troops now in nearby Ukraine, some in the Baltics are scared that history is about to repeat itself.
If Ukraine falls, then Russian ambitions won't stop with this. And I believe that we are going to be next in Russia's list of actions.
It shows the attitude of Russia, how it is, how it goes to another country very easily and is acting in an aggressive manner.
But this memorial service is controversial. These veterans fought in Hitler's army, and they are seen by some as Nazi sympathisers, particularly by Russian speakers living in Latvia. It's a similar dynamic to Ukraine. Pro-Moscow local Russian speakers accusing pro-Western nationalists of being right-wing extremists. And like Ukraine, Russian speakers here say they are discriminated against.
I feel myself like people who is second class, because I have no equal rights with Latvian peoples.
Alexandra has lived his whole life in Latvia, but when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, like many Russians, he was not automatically made a Latvian citizen. So he lost his job with Riga City Council, and today is classed as a non-citizen without the right to vote.
We want equal rights for our languages. We want equal rights in social and economic rights. It is all.
Around 300,000 Russian speakers, or 13% of Latvia's population, are so-called non-citizens. To become Latvian, they have to prove their knowledge of the Latvian language and culture in a citizenship test, even if they were born here. But the Latvian government says it is encouraging them to become citizens, and that the Kremlin is using the issue to create political instability.
It's a massive propaganda, massive information campaign, even warfare, not only here, and not only using Russian-speaking media, but also using other channels.
Russian speakers often live separate lives from their Latvian neighbours, with different national holidays, and often only consuming media coming from Moscow. So there's a fear that the Kremlin could encourage Latvia's predominantly Russian-speaking border regions to follow Crimea's example and join Russia.
The situation when so many people are heavily relying on the Russian news sources, it means that actually Russia have instrument to change their minds if they would like to.
Diverging views about who is to blame for the Ukraine crisis are creating an ever greater rift in Latvian society. Until now, Russian speakers have mainly lived together peacefully with ethnic Latvians. But if the conflict in Ukraine gets worse, that relationship could turn frosty.
Well, for more on this, we're joined now by our guest, Latvian political analyst Ivars Ijabs, who joins us from Riga. Hello, thank you for being with us on France 24.
Hi, good to be with you.
Is the situation in Russian-speaking parts of Latvia ripe for a Crimean scenario, do you think?
I mean, these parallels are quite limited. I mean, we are, of course, very worried about what's going on in Crimea. just because we also have this colonial experience with Russians and so on and so forth. But at the same time, of course, Latvia is not Ukraine. The Latvian state is much more stable and much more consolidated, and it's much more prosperous, actually. Let's not forget that actually in the Ukrainian case, the average income of a person is 2.5 times lower than the average income in Russian Federation. In Latvia, the average income is higher than in Russia, which means that there is no practical reasons for most Russian speakers to think about such ideas. On the other hand, of course, there are also radicals, just like Mr. Gaponenko, Alexander, with whom you talked to. Russian speakers in Latvia is not a very homogeneous mass. These are pretty different people.
And Russian speakers once dominated Latvia's elite, that is until the collapse of communism. They now feel like second-class citizens, they say. Couldn't a return to Russia's orbit be a rather understandable temptation?
Yes, but at the same time, I'm not sure to what extent issues like citizenship, and this, let's be clear, these not so-called non-citizens are those Soviet-era immigrants here in Latvia who have this special status. They enjoy all civil and human rights, of course, here in Latvia, and social rights. They become pensions, they can work, and so on and so forth. The only difference is that they don't have the political rights. They cannot vote, which is a very particular historical example, because Latvia, as you probably know, is not the country which was created in the year 1991, but is a country which was created in the year 1918, and then we had this 50-year-long Soviet occupation, which means that those people who stayed here during the Soviet era didn't have any automatic right to citizenship. They had to naturalize themselves. But our naturalization procedures are very liberal, even, let me say, compared with France, actually.
And we've been hearing in Crimea the Russian speakers saying that their language is in danger. A bid to make Russia the country's second language was overwhelmingly rejected just 2 years ago in Latvia. Wouldn't this be the time to reconsider, to perhaps better integrate ethnic Russians?
Let's say the problem is, of course, this is not just the Russian problem. This is the problem for both Latvians and Russians. Let me start with the fact that most Russians who are living here have, especially the youngest generation, have perfectly learned the Latvian language, and most of them don't have any problems with that language. I'm a professor at the university. Many of my students are Russian speakers. They have sometimes even better Latvian than my Latvian-born students. But the problem is, of course, that the Latvian language, and this is a perception of the Latvian political elite, we feel that our small language of 1.5 million people is endangered by many great languages in these times of globalization. And first and foremost, the threat comes from the influence of Russians. For that reason, the Latvian government has taken many steps in order to, let's say, prevent this hegemony of the Russian language. And at the same time, I think we still, in some places, we are pretty liberal with the Russian language. For example, we still have 2 parallel school systems, one for Latvians and one for Russians, where, let's say, young Russian-speaking people are taught in their native language. So I think that there are still some corrections possible, because we have to recognize that Russian is really an influential language in the whole world, and so on and so forth. At the same time, it wouldn't be possible to make it just a second state language, which, let's say, this is a question of dialogue between both ethnic communities here in Latvia.
Well, looking now at the issue from Moscow's point of view, last weekend the Russian ambassador to Latvia said the Kremlin was planning to offer passports and pensions to ethnic Russians to, quote, save them from poverty. Has a form of political takeover already begun, perhaps?
This is actually much more a problem for Estonia, because most Russians who are living in Estonia are Russian citizens. Most of Russians who are living here in Latvia are either Latvian citizens or Latvian non-citizens. There are, let's say, some practical or utilitarian reasons for these Russians who have this non-citizenship, which is kind of a green card, let's say. Let me explain it this way. Here in Latvia, status, there are still some temptations for them to take the Russian citizens for purely utilitarian reasons, because Russian citizens go to pension, they retire at the age 55. Which is, let's say, a very particular case in our region, because as you probably know, also from the French example, the average retirement age is rising in all the countries, and in Latvia it's about 63, 64, or something like that. For those older generation Russians who don't have Latvian citizenship, it is sometimes very tempting to think about the Russian citizenship, because then they can get an early pension. From the other hand, there are many, let's say, such utilitarian issues like visa-free travel to the Russian Federation for the non-citizens. Me, as a Latvian citizen, I have to apply for a visa in order to go to the Russian Federation. Non-citizens, which means these former Soviet-era immigrants, they have the privilege to go to Russia without visa, which is also, let's say, which also prevents people from taking the Latvian citizenship. So the situation here is very much complicated, but the comparison with Ukraine, as I said, is rather limited, because it started actually with a, let's say, an attempted revolution, and that's why, let's say, the Russian Federation tried and still tries to exploit the weakness of the Ukrainian state. The Latvian state, also because of our participation in NATO and in the EU, is much stronger than the Ukrainian state.
And just very briefly, if you will, are there any lessons that Latvia can learn from the Ukrainian situation to avoid a Crimean scenario?
Of course. Of course. I think actually this is also a common European problem which also affects us. We see that our elite, not just in Eastern Europe where the situation is really dramatic sometimes, but also in the West, by the way, our elites are pretty weak. Also because of the economic crisis. Look at this Yanukovych guy. Of course, he basically couldn't control the situation in his country, and he was corrupt to the, let's say, actually immense extent. At the same time, look at this young elite of Ukraine, which also doesn't control the situation, and so on and so forth. But this is also the problem in many other countries in Europe, where elites, because of the crisis, are very weak, and that's why they firstly can't control the situation in their countries. And from that point of view, of course, they are very eager, very inclined to use and misuse different kinds of ethnic, national, linguistic, religious, and so on and so forth sentiments in order to, let's say, get some kind of legitimacy for themselves.
That's certainly a lesson for all of us. Ivar Shejavs, thank you very much for having talked to us. Thank you for having been on France 24.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
And with that, we leave this hour live from Paris. Stay tuned. There's a full news update at the top of the hour.